Joining me now is our political panel, former Victorian Liberal Party President Michael Kroger and former Labor Minister Stephen Conroy. Gentlemen, thank you for your time.
Andrew.
Now, I've got a surprise for you. I'm going to play Michael Kroger and Angus Taylor. Let's have a listen to this.
He's got to stop being a commentator and start being a treasurer. He's got to stop being a commentator and start acting like, a treasurer. This bloke is more a commentator.
The Treasurer is much more comfortable giving forecasts, making commentary, mostly about doom and gloom, rather than telling us what the plan is.
Well, Michael Kroger, they say imitation is the best form of, most sincerest form of flattery. So how are you feeling? You're giving them their attack lines these days.
Well, Angus Taylor's got it right. My only criticism of Angus... My only criticism, mate, would be that it took him a while to work that out. No, Andrew, I think the point is this. I think the Treasurer...
Clearly a viewer of Afternoon Agenda, I'd have to say, Angus Taylor.
The Treasurer is meant to be in charge of the economy. It's very clear to every Australian the economy is in charge of this bloke. He's not in charge of the economy. He just sits there and, he basically reads the Financial Review and says, rates are going up, inflation's going up, unemployment's going up. It's all terrible out there. I don't know. Gee, it's terrible. I mean, we waited for the budget to show leadership. Well, there was no leadership. It was hopeless. This fellow is afraid, and I know Graham Richardson's a great fan of his. I'm not. I think he's the weakest link in the federal government. They've had some very strongly performing ministers. I give Richard Marles credit, people like him. But this bloke is, I think, really out of his depth. He is not in control of the economy. The economy is controlling him, and that's a big worry, mate.
Well, Angus Taylor obviously watches Afternoon Agenda. I can assure you Jim Chalmers does. So, Stephen Conroy, would you care to rebuff that? Is Jim Chalmers the weakest link?
Look, Michael's been banging this drum from almost day one. It is disappointing to see that it's taken Angus 6 months to get Michael's devastating lines up. But look, if that's the best Angus can do, just parrot what Michael says. They're in for a long period in opposition. Jim Chalmers
he couldn't do any better, Stephen.
A sensible and rational budget last week. What he set out to do was not go on a cheap vote-buying spree, pretending he can solve all issues, of throwing money to, like a 6-month exemption, halving of the fuel tax rebates, 6 months. The punters saw through that. They knew it was a fraud, that it was not actually a plan to fix the actual problem. So Jim took the sensible position that he wasn't going to try and treat the Australian public like mugs. He was going to tell them the truth about the gravity of our circumstances, and he was going to build through that to the next budget in May, when we'll see a far more better picture of the Australian economy. But he delivered Labor's economic promises. Our election program delivered in that budget. And he resisted cheap pork barrelling like Michael and Angus are secretly telling them to do, so they could then criticise them for spending too much.
Didn't bring home
They're
the
on
bacon
both sides of this argument. It's embarrassing.
No pork barrelling, didn't bring home the bacon, as Keating would say. Now, look, Husic...
absolutely not.
Ed Husic and Madeleine King, are they split at the moment, Michael Kroger?
Well, very clearly, she's tippy-toeing with the gas suppliers, and he's basically telling it like it is. He's the authentic voice of the Labor government in relation to these things.
So you think the gas companies are greedy?
I do. And I think they're selling at wartime pricing overseas, and they've treated the Australian public and the Australian government like mugs. This bloke's on the right track. There ought to be a domestic gas reservation like there is in Western Australia, and credit to that Western Australian government for doing it. Selling all this gas overseas at record prices and throwing us the scraps, I mean, for goodness sake, we're being treated like mugs. These are Australia's natural resources, and we're being treated like mugs. So he's basically on the right track. But before we get off Stephen's comment about Chalmers... he's not going to make cheap. He's not going to cheap this and cheap that. Stephen, before the election, Your people could solve everything. There was the cost of living crisis. There was the, global warming crisis, the aged care crisis, Scott Morrison, terrible. There was the which will go down in 20 years' time, they'll still be talking about the $275 pledge. Not once has this been said since the election. That is the most devastating critique of this government. They will go to their grave having spread, I won't use the word, rubbish to the Australian public about how they were going to be $275 better off. It was a reckless comment. Could we please see the modelling, Stephen? Let's have some independent investment bank check on the modelling to see whether it was a reckless statement. If these people were directors under the corporations law and company directors had made that type of reckless promise, they'd be going to stay with the king for a while.
All right.
This was a reckless promise and a disgrace.
Let me ask Stephen Conroy, is Madeleine King being too soft on the gas companies?
Well, look, I think she's signed an agreement in good faith with them, and they've really sandbagged her. They set her up. They didn't tell her they were planning on doing all the increases that they've done, and I think she's disappointed with them. I think Albo and Ed Husic are doing a great job of calling out the absolute hypocrisy, and you can see the disappointment when Madeleine talks in the way the gas companies have behaved. So we're working through, the Labor government is working through the different options. And I'm on pretty much been on a unity ticket with Michael over the gas issue for probably 3 months now, talking about the need for a reservation, talking about the need to rein the greed of these gas companies in. I mean, the one difference that you'll be able to show on tomorrow's show is when you asked Ted O'Brien, were gas companies being greedy? He said no. You asked Michael Kroger, he said yes. So Michael is absolutely in the right
Very
place.
quick.
Ted O'Brien wants to protect his old mates.
There you go.
So Ted O'Brien, no, gas companies aren't greedy. Liberal Party says gas companies are not greedy. Well, the Australian public has got a pretty strong view about this. If you look at the poll in this morning's paper, they think they're absolutely being ripped off.
All right, I want to ask both of you gentlemen about the Victorian election, not long to go now. Michael Kroger, the longest lockdown in the world, or maybe London or somewhere else was close, a bigger budget deficit, loads of debt. Why does Dan Andrews look like he's going to romp it in?
So that's a very good and legitimate question. And the answer is this, Andrew. People are voting for strength and they're voting for stability. And that's what Andrews represents. That's not what I think of him. You can imagine what I think. I think he's been probably the worst Premier Victoria's ever had. And I think he's made a lot of shocking decisions, such as arresting pregnant women, arresting Jewish worshippers, etc. But people think he's a strong leader, he's a stable leader. It doesn't matter that all his underlings and ministers are all going. No one's ever heard of those ministers and MPs anyway, so they mean nothing. A lot of his team are retiring. No one's ever heard of most of them. The fact that Andrews is still portraying strength and stability, that's why he's in front of the polls. Of course, lots can happen in the last few days of an election campaign, but that's why he's in front, Andrew. People are forgiving him all his ills and thus far giving him lots of kudos for strength and stability.
And Stephen Conroy?
Yeah, look, Michael makes some good points there. That is the perception, but that is a perception based on the fact that Matthew Guy is probably the worst Liberal Party leader that they've had in a long time, and they've had some crackers over the last few years. You didn't hear a single word from Michael Kroger in that 2 or 3 minutes he just spoke, where he had one good word to say about Matthew Guy,
because he asked me about Daniel Andrews. I think Matthew's a terrific leader,
This is the truth. So there is a component in Victoria that do want to vote against Daniel Andrews. And they look over at Matthew Guy and they go, oh, we just can't do that. And they're going to vote for Andrews. So the only danger you've got here is the perception that Andrews is going to romp it in, as you said earlier, Andrew. And so that's the one danger for Daniel Andrews and the team here, that they get a little bit complacent, a little bit cocky. They're not a message now. Andrews has proved he is the most disciplined campaigner, 160-odd days in a row of press conferences, and he never put a foot wrong, not a hair out of place. So we know he is a really strong campaigner under enormous pressure. But the punters are looking at the two choices and going, It's Matthew Guy. I can't do it.
Okay, Stephen Conroy, Michael Kroger, thanks so much for your time.